just to let you know that today's session will be taken in 3 parts. As I said, we've got a lot of business to get through, but first we're going to have a little chat about health and safety, then we're going to discuss USS, and then we'll move on to discuss the 4 fights dispute. As we want to make this an interactive session, there is capacity for you to ask questions. You can do this using the Q&A box, which you will also find at the bottom of the screen. Please don't be shy, put as many questions as you like into that. Please do it whilst our speakers are speaking, because we don't have a lot of time and we've got a lot to get through. So I'll be trying to pick up as many of those as possible as soon as each section is sort of concluded in terms of the introductions, and then we will be moving on. So I'm not going to take up any more of your time, because the people you really want to hear from are Jo and John. So yeah, I will hand over to Jo now to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you everybody for joining us. So yeah, let's start with health and safety. What I wanted to do before we even get on to sort of the 2 disputes in HE is really talk you through an overview of what UCU has done during the pandemic, and also where I think we are now. Before I even get on to any of that, I actually really want to start by praising the work of no doubt many people in this meeting already, the officers, the staff and the reps who have literally been saving lives during this pandemic. We know that a lot of our managers, a lot of vice chancellors took reckless decisions this time last year. We saw, and many of us had to deal with, the disastrous consequences unfold. Anybody who was kept safe during this pandemic, whether it was yourself, your colleagues or your students, was down to the hard work of this union and its members. So I really wanted to start with praising that, because we've got through this together. What I also want to do is go through 5 principles that we launched at the beginning of this summer and just remind everybody of them as we head into the beginning of term. And in particular, I'm thinking of all of our Scottish members and people who work in Scottish universities, who will no doubt be aware of the soaring COVID rates and the commitment to a return to in-person and bringing students back on campus. So I don't know if somebody's able to share them on screen right now, but if not, I'm happy to just quickly talk through them. I don't know if Ed or somebody else, but if not, I will bring them up. Sorry, my computer has chosen to go very slowly at the precise moment that, there they are. So we, as a union, and I'm sure as many of you, we want to remain safe, and we know that big gatherings of people may not be the best way to do that, but we do also want to see a return to in-person activities on our campuses when it's safe to do so. You know, I taught for many years myself, and I know that it makes a big difference. So what we have been saying to Gavin Williamson, to employers in the sector, is we can only deliver high quality and consistent, not something that changes week in, week out, depending on what our managers want us to do at any one moment, if we know what we are doing and we can plan. Disruption, chaos, last minute changes to decisions do not allow us to deliver anything that is consistent or to the quality that we as professionals want to do. And that is across the board, regardless of what you are doing in your job in a university. So we started with that as our first principle. Underpinning that is a clear focus on ensuring the health and safety of all staff in the post-16 education sector. Again, underpinning this is that the physical and mental health of our students is of vital importance. I heard countless times last year from many of you how distressing it was to be sitting at the end of a Zoom call with students trapped in their accommodation with deteriorating mental health and being expected to be the shock absorbers of poor planning and of negligence from university managers. So I see 1 to 3 of these principles as really coherent. Number 1 is about protecting our well-being, our workload, the expectation that we're just an elastic resource that can be stretched and pivoted and expected to do multiple things at any one time. We need planning, and that means no disruption or last minute changes. And our students deserve the same as well. So that's kind of 1 to 3 in terms of where we are with those principles. What we also want to see is university campuses not becoming centres of community COVID transmission, as we saw last year. And of course, all of this relies on adequate funding to be made available to universities. So you may have missed them earlier in the summer, but they were the principles that we wrote to Gavin Williamson about. We are still to hear back from him, even though we wrote to him over a month ago about those. As we move towards the beginning of term, I also want to remind you that we are supporting branches who feel that their university management are not adhering to the health and safety risk assessments that have been established, or in general, if you feel that as a branch, as a member in that branch, your health and safety is not being treated as a priority. We throughout the pandemic, particularly this time last year, Northumbria were our first UCU branch to do a ballot over COVID health and safety. They were actually the first union in the UK to do a ballot and win one over health and safety. And just recently, literally in the last month, our prison members who work in prison education, who work for Novus, have recently just concluded a successful dispute they had around their own health and safety. So what I just want to do is pass John over just for a second to explain what we would be asking you and supporting you to do as branches if you feel moving into the beginning of term health and safety is not being treated as a priority. John?
Thanks, Jo. So we know that the next few weeks are going to be crucial in terms of returning to the workplace, students returning to universities. And we also recognise how challenging this is going to be for you as branch officers, for you as reps, and for you as members. So underpinning each of the 5 principles are almost like a menu of demands for you to begin to discuss as union members, begin to frame your demands, to take them to your management. Because one of the things that the last 18 months has kind of re-taught us are the basics of health and safety, where our legal protections are, and how do we behave as trade unionists within the workplace when we're bargaining with the employer. So if you were to take the first one, the clear focus on a consistent high quality education provision, one of the really important things that underpins that makes that happen, would be up-to-date risk assessments being undertaken by the employer and in consultation with the union. Now, that is a legal obligation on every employer. So one of the things that you could be doing is framing that as a demand. If you as the union branch have not been consulted on with your risk assessment, that is a breach of the health and safety legislation, and the employer needs to be challenged on those things. So what we would advise you to do is to meet fairly urgently as a branch and look at those principles and look at the menu of demands that hang underneath each one and begin to frame demands that are relevant to your workplace. What are the particular issues? It might be issues around risk assessments. It might be issues around workplace mitigations. It might be issues over agreements on remote learning or face-to-face learning. They're going to be different for every workplace, but you meet with, as members, you decide on what the demands are that you want to take to your employer, and then take them to the employer as a set of demands. And then you meet again as a branch, as members, and reflect on what your employer has responded. Hopefully they've said yes, but we know that the world doesn't work like that. So what's your next step? How are you going to escalate that? Do you need to start making those demands more clearly? Do you need to start talking to your regional offices about the potential for ballots, for action? Do you need to escalate? Now, what are the challenges that you want to put onto the employer in order to make get your demands met? Your demands will be reasonable. They will be within the framework that we have set within those principles. Any reasonable employer would meet with the union and would consult and negotiate and come to an agreement on how to keep workers safe. It is the legal duty of every employer to maintain the health and safety of employees. It's their responsibility. And as part of that, to consult with the union on risk assessments, on mitigations. And as I said, one of the things the last 18 months has taught us is it's reminded us that health and safety legislation does work in our favour as trade unionists, and we need to use our legal framework as well as using our basic trade union power. If need be, we escalate and we take action to assert our rights. And it's as simple as that. So have a branch meeting, frame your demands, take the demands to the employer, reflect on their response, and if need be, begin to escalate. So I don't know if we've got any health and safety questions.
We certainly do, John. Thank you. Thank you both for all of that. We have got a few questions that have come through. I'm going to try and summarise them because we don't have a lot of time. But here are a couple to kick us off. We've had one in from Aberdeen. Employers have recently decided they're no longer obliged to risk assess teaching spaces, despite a plan to return to in-person teaching from the start of term. They're considering that COVID's now analogous to flu. What should we do in that scenario? John?
Do you want to go? Okay. Well, that's nonsense. It's not flu. We know that it isn't yet flu. There will be a time when the vaccination rollout has reached such a stage when COVID could be analogous to flu, but we are not there yet. But secondly, health and safety is a broad concept. It's up to us to demand or to make demands on the employer, and they are required to risk assess. If their assessment of risk is COVID is not a risk, it's our responsibility to challenge that. Because at the moment, COVID is a risk. It is a greater risk than flu, both to the health and safety of our members, but also to the health and safety of students. And the majority, there will be, I would presume, the majority of students will not have been double vaccinated by now, and they will be more likely to catch it and spread it. And COVID is not yet analogous to flu. So if that's their response, your response is to meet as a branch, challenge that, to say, as a united group of workers, we do not accept that. And if need be, we will escalate this demand.
Yeah, I think what might be helpful as well is if I think at the beginning of this year in January, we held an event where we had numerous branches who'd been involved in health and safety disputes, who contributed almost as a case study what they had done. And Northumbria were in a very similar position in terms of saying that there was a risk. And you may remember at the beginning of the pandemic in Newcastle, I think at Northumbria, 750 students tested positive for COVID and only 1 in 10 had symptoms. They held a mass member meeting, like John is saying, before they triggered their ballot. So there's a number of learnings, I think, from other branches that have been through what you're going through, who have pushed back. So we will send that information out so that people can refresh themselves with the tactics that other branches have developed. So John's just talked you through it, but if you want to hear it from a rep's perspective in terms of what they have done, that might be helpful as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you both. I think we've had a few people talking and suggesting about some of the things that people might be demanding in terms of, the things that you were talking about of making demands, things around masks, social distancing, ventilation. Some members saying that in Scotland, the NHS has retained this 2-metre social distancing. So that's something that could be being demanded. So some food for thought there. And then just one final question for this section, I think. John, maybe to you, because you were talking about escalation. Somebody's asked, what's the best way to escalate if you consulted the employer and they're refusing your requests?
So the formal way to do it is you discuss with your regional office. So you move from your branch to your regional office, and your regional official will then discuss with you what the most appropriate escalation might be. It might be their engagement in terms of negotiation with the employer. It might be beginning to look at an indicative ballot. So as soon as the employer has said no and you wish to escalate, the next step is to move to your regional office.
That is really helpful. Thank you. I'm very conscious of time and that we've got a lot to get through. So I'm going to move us on to the next section. If we've got any time at the end, we might come back to some of the other questions that have been asked on health and safety. But I know that a lot of you have come along today to hear about USS, and that is the next section that we are going to talk about. So if I can hand back to Joe, and we will now move on to talk about USS.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it is clear that a lot of people have attended specifically around this issue. We are here again, for those of you who are in a USS branch or in USS. And we're here because what we are witnessing with USS has to be seen as that wider attack on education, attack on our conditions, connected to the marketisation of education and the need to drive down staff costs and extract value. USS is the largest non-public sector DB scheme. So I think it's inevitable that we have faced these attacks because, it doesn't make enough profit for private finance. But with that said, we have been here before and we have won. If you were part of the disputes in 2018, this scheme is still a defined benefit scheme because of you, because of the action that you took, because of the action that all of us took, and because of things that we have been doing since. We were just talking about health and safety. You only need to cast your mind back over the past 18 months to see how management not only treat us, but treat our students if they think they can get away with it. So please don't think that if it hadn't been for the action that you've already taken, we wouldn't be in a worse position than we already are. And I think that's really important to remind ourselves of, because I know after this year, people are tired. I know after not just the USS disputes since 2018, but the USS disputes we've been in since over 10 years now, people are tired. But we are in a position again where we have to fight and defend our pension because our employers have demonstrated that they would rather invest in cutting our pension than in actually working properly with us to not just keep it a competitive and an attractive pension, but also future-proof it. So I'm just going to talk through a little bit of what has been happening most recently to give you the context and also perhaps dispel a few myths that have been circulating, not least of all at the behest of our employers recently. So what is happening now? On Tuesday this week, employers, so that is UUK, who are the umbrella organisation that represent all of the vice-chancellors in the pre-92 sector, they voted through pension cuts at the USS Joint Negotiating Committee. That Joint Negotiating Committee has reps from UCU, reps from UUK and an independent chair. It is worth pointing out the independent chair has never yet once voted with UCU and also votes with UUK, but putting that aside for a moment. The cuts that they have voted through mean in general a 35% loss of guaranteed retirement income. I would encourage you, if you haven't, to use our modelling tool. It's ucu.org.uk/USS modeler to find out what it means specifically for you. We had already called this meeting, but since that Tuesday meeting, I think it's even more important to address some of the misinformation which employers have been circulating about this process in the last few days. In the run-up to that meeting and in the several weeks beforehand, UCU have developed a set of fully costed alternative proposals to the fully costed alternative proposals that UUK put forward. Now, UUK have been saying, UCU didn't table these proposals, so it's not our fault that we had to vote for our proposals because they were the only ones there. But what they are not telling you is that they essentially refused to provide the same level of covenant support to our proposals as they did their own. So that covenant support is commitments about staying in the scheme for 20 years and managing debt. So they were willing to say they would do that for their own proposals. They didn't say that they would do it for ours. Our negotiators asked for an extension so that employers could be consulted on providing that covenant support, and the employers' negotiators refused that request and moved to a vote anyway. So it is disingenuous, the messaging that we are seeing coming out regarding that meeting. Our proposals were cut off at the knees before they could even go anywhere because the funding was not put there. This crisis that we are now in, as many of you will know, has been caused by a flawed valuation process and employers' unwillingness, repeated unwillingness to fundamentally work with us. And I think it's important that we understand both of those because it's the latter that we need to change first. Everybody agrees the valuation's flawed. We had 2 JET reports that were confirming that. but our employers are not willing to work with us sufficiently on it. Now, what do we want? What do we think a win looks like in this dispute? Well, I think there's a short-term and there's a long-term answer to that question. USS, it chose to conduct a valuation in 2020. The markets were crashing because of the pandemic. It's clear that we will never get a perfect resolution within the constraints of that valuation. So what do we need to do? We need to focus on getting as much as we can from this valuation in the short term and making sure that we're in a position to get something better when the next valuation takes place, which should be as soon as possible. It is worth saying that the proposals which UCU developed were specifically designed to provide a short-term solution while a more fundamental work is done to getting that longer-term victory. So I will just talk you through some of that. The things that we as a union specifically focused on in those proposals were, one, making employers pay more so they are on the hook for this mess and not us. Number two, making all members pay less, so putting more money in your pocket now whilst we sort out the problems with the scheme, which, as I've said, the employers have refused to properly do, so it's only appropriate they foot the bill. And making the scheme more appealing and accessible for the thousands of lower paid and precariously employed members who have found it too expensive to join. Those were the underpinning, the principles of the counter proposals that our employers refused to give the same covenant support for. Now, from our perspective, if we can make progress in all of those areas, whilst preserving as much of your guaranteed pension as possible, that would be a really, really good start. But it won't be enough. Anyone in this meeting who has been part of these USS disputes, who have studied them, know that that is not enough, because we all need assurances that there will be long-term improvements as well. Part of that includes governance reform, and not just a review of governance like the ones which the employers are talking about. We've had enough reviews, we need action from them. And part of it includes a new valuation that reflects the financial recovery of the scheme and the HE sector from the pandemic. So if we get into a dispute and force employers back to the negotiating table, we want them to be talking about these long-term issues with us as well, and not just the short-term ones right in front of us about how we resolve the 2020 valuation. And obviously we fundamentally disagree with the employer's decision to push through a vote on Tuesday that means a loss in pension value for us. And that is really why we are where we are, and why we need everybody to understand that coming out of this meeting. In terms of how do we get what we want, I think we all have to be really honest right now and start being honest and building a campaign with members that sit alongside us in our branches, because it's going to be by significant industrial action. That is how we have maintained this scheme in the past, and that industrial action will have to use all the tools at our disposal, not just but including strike action. There is a meeting next week which is a special higher education sector conference. That meeting will be making decisions about where we go with this dispute. The purpose of this meeting is because we want as many people involved in this campaign right now from the get-go. There was another meeting that we had as a union back in the summer. That meeting made some really important decisions. Chief amongst that was that this campaign around USS and Foresight should be member level. So you feeding in at every opportunity, and that is what we are starting with this process. So key decisions will be made next week, and it's important following this meeting. You know, I can see that there's hundreds of people here now. It is important following this meeting that you check in with your departmental reps, check in with your committee, start getting involved in these conversations that maybe, and for good reason, I understand it, other people have done for the past 12 months or the past 18 months, but that we need everybody to be fundamentally part of now. So I am just going to hold over to John, given I've just laid out where we are, what a win looks like, what we're going to need to do to win. So John, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. So this is going to be a battle. This is going to be a really tough fight. But it's really important to recognise that it's a battle that's going to involve industrial action. But industrial action is a tactic. It's not a strategy. The strategy has to be really clear. We have to create the conditions whereby the employer is better off talking to us than not talking to us. At the moment, the conditions are that they're better off not talking to us. It's more advantageous to them to not listen to us, not talk to us, not engage. We have to create the conditions whereby it's better for them to talk to us, to engage, to negotiate, so that we can have a joint position to win a better pension scheme. The way that we're going to get that to happen is by using industrial action. But industrial action is the tactic, one of the tactics that we will use. There are others, but it's not a strategy in and of itself. The strategy is to win a position whereby the employer is talking to us. And we're going to use industrial action to force that to happen. If they move without us having to take industrial action, then that's great. Industrial action is the tactic that we think is going to be inevitable. But if we're going to win using industrial action, it's going to have to be a significant fight. And there are things that we need members to start doing now in preparation for that, because we will have to move. Now, as Joe said, the conference next week will talk about timescales and we'll agree the tactical, make the tactical decisions about when we move to ballot and so on. But we will need to begin to move to ballot, and we need to win an overwhelming victory in that ballot. And that will take hard work from everybody. So let's think about what that work involves. The starting point, the most important starting point, is we need you all from now to be out there recruiting members. We need hundreds and thousands more people to join UCU, because the more people we have as members, the more people will be involved in industrial action, the more pressure will be placed on each of those vice chancellors to put pressure on the employer's body to say, we should talk. And if we get more members, we get more action, we get more pressure. And it's the pressure on the employer that we need to build. So the first and most important thing is start recruiting. Look around at where you are low in membership density, map out your membership, start that recruitment process. Find your departmental reps, get them to talk to people, to listen to people, and to get people to join the union urgently. Now is the priority. We need hundreds and thousands of members before we will win this dispute. The second thing you're going to need to do, and one of the things I wanted to say about that, is that when we look at the disputes that we've had in Novus with the prison dispute and at University of Chester, one of the things that happened was that we saw huge increases in membership, big increases in density. People will join a union if they see that union standing up with members, standing up for the things that are right. They don't join a union because they think it's going to give them cheap car insurance. They're going to join a union because they can see that union is taking action and is fighting. And that's what the message we need to communicate to get people to join the union. The second thing you're going to need to do is go and listen to and talk to members. Have one-on-one conversations with members. Talk to your reps, talk to your branch officers, get members talking to members. We need to have those discussions going on so that people are engaging in these meetings. They're taking the points of these meetings back to each other. Third thing that we think you should do, and we think you should do this within as quickly as you can, is meet as a branch before next week's conference. Because we want, one of the things the last conference called for was a member-led campaign. So we want you to engage in the motions that are on that agenda for the conference. We want you to discuss them, talk to the delegates, let delegates know what members think, listen to and talk to those members and those delegates so that people are having a conversation ready for next week's conference. So that conference is representative of the membership. You're then going to have to start thinking about a get out the vote campaign, and we will have more of these briefings as the weeks go on, as we get closer to the ballot and as the ballot begins to go on. But we'll need to talk about get out the vote tactics. How do we map and chart those conversations? How do we begin to record who's voting? How do we maximise the turnout and maximise the positive vote? But there's two other groups of people that you need to be talking to, and I would suggest this is a matter of urgency. The first is the other campus unions. talk to the other union representatives within your university so that everybody knows what is going on and what UCU are calling for, and seek solidarity support from Unite, Unison, GMB, the other unions that you'll be working with on your campuses. And then the second group of people is have the conversation with the students' union. The really important solidarity that we will get and support is from students. Students recognise that this battle is not aimed at them, but we need to be talking to students urgently so they can offer us their solidarity and support, but also they can join us, they can have those conversations, because vice chancellors and the employers will seek to divide everybody as much as possible. We need as much unity as we can. So have a branch meeting, talk about the motions that are going to the conference, recruit as many members as you can, talk to the campus unions, talk to your student unions, and do those things as a matter of urgency. Move on to questions, shall we?
Absolutely, and we have got plenty coming through, so thank you to everyone who has submitted questions. We will not have time to get through them all, but what I can say is that we're going to put together an FAQ document on each of the different areas we're talking about today, so that you will be able to get some further answers and further information after this meeting. I'll try and sort of summarize the kind of themes that are coming through in the questions rather than going through individual ones. We've had a few questions about what industrial action is actually going to be looking at. Do we know yet whether we're going to be talking about the alternate proposals that UCU's put forward and pushing for those, for pushing for no detriment? You know, can we be specific about what that's going to look like? A couple of questions about what other aspects of our wider campaign on pensions we want to be thinking about. So quite a few people asking if there is anything happening in relation to legal routes, and also about wider engagement, for example, with MPs, and whether we need to be mobilising in that sense as well. And we've also had a question about the sort of nature of industrial action, so whether we might be thinking about action short of strikes, or in fact moving beyond that and moving straight to general walkouts. So you know, I think it would be really helpful if you could perhaps get to grips with a few of those. I'll hand over to you first, Jo, maybe.
I'll try and kind of address some of them, and if I don't, I'm hoping John might come in and pick up maybe what's just slipped my mind. I think in terms of the counter proposals that we put forward, I think that, you know, there's certain elements of them, such as, you know, lowering contribution rates so that we have more money in our pocket, not letting employers off the hook to cover the short-term costs that we're looking at in order to guarantee a longer-term solution. Now, I would see them as something that should remain consistent through our position, and particularly and it was in my email, the proposals that we put forward about how we keep what are currently thousands of lower paid members who are opting out of the scheme because it's too expensive. They have to be addressed. So this isn't a dispute per se about, you know, the employers chose their proposals and wouldn't even give ours the time of day in terms of covenant support, because actually if we, you know, once we're engaged in industrial action, we may change our aims. You know, they may become slightly different as the negotiating position changes, but there are fundamentals, and they're what I outlined at the beginning, of things that we need in both the short and the long term that at the moment our employers are not committing to. I think in terms of action that we would be looking at, you know, if we think back to 2018, the shock tactic of those 14 days in the escalating pattern served us very well, as did a live strike mandate for after Easter, which employers were pretty terrified about. We need to create, and I think, you know, the fact that we are in not a post-COVID, because we're still very much in the pandemic working situation, we need to look at what opportunities of disruption are equally available to us now that would be unpredictable to our employers, as we did in 2018 with those days which were unpredictable to our employers. We may decide that that kind of escalating pattern makes sense again in conjunction with other things. We may decide that we need to create leverage in different ways. What I would say is we will face, as we move towards a campaign on a ballot, and particularly as we move towards any action that we want to do, claims that we are creating a crisis in education. We have not created this crisis. If anything, UCU is the one and the only party within this network of people who have influence over USS that are trying to move away from a triennial trauma that is associated with every valuation that we have. Every opportunity, we are trying to future-proof the scheme in a way that it is not thrown into chaos. So there may end up being what will be called crisis, but it will not be a crisis of our making. And if there is a crisis, we need to make sure that we extract as much leverage from that to get exactly what we deserve, which is a decent, stable pension where younger, and not always younger, but lower paid members are currently priced out of it, and where our employers just think they can keep attacking it, valuation after valuation, and blaming the trustee, blaming the valuation process, but doing nothing meaningful to work with us on it, and in fact actually voting through their own cuts, while simultaneously saying that they would like to work with us on it. I'm sure I missed some of the things that may have been added, so I don't know if John wants to add to anything.
So yeah, maybe just a couple of points. The first thing I was going to say is just a repeat of what I was saying earlier about the difference between tactics and strategy. The strategy is to force the employer to talk to us, to create the conditions whereby they are better off talking to us than not talking to us. Now, one of those tactics is going to be industrial action, and we don't need to lay out now what the nature of that industrial action will be, partly because the special conference next week will begin to discuss those things. We've also got elected members of the Higher Education Committee will debate what those tactics are. But we're a democratic union. Members will begin to discuss what tactics they think are best. They'll feed those into their branches. They'll feed those into the national office. We'll have more of these briefings whereby those tactical discussions will take place. It could involve all sorts of things that aren't just as straightforward as strikes. But I don't think anything other than industrial action is going to force the employer. But there are a whole range of other things that we will be considering. Of course, we're going to be talking to MPs. Of course, we're going to be lobbying. Of course, we're going to be doing all of those other things to create the conditions whereby the employer has to talk to us. It will be a member-led campaign. Members will tell us what those things are. And I suppose the other thing just to stress is we are making completely reasonable demands. We're not asking for anything that is not possible. This is our members paying conditions. This is a very straightforward, simple demand. The employer has done something wrong, not us. We are simply asking for something completely reasonable while our pension scheme is being attacked by people who don't have the interests of our members or the interests of students or the interests of education at heart. They're simply in this to line their own pockets.
And I would just like to add to that before, because I can see you're eager to move on. We have lived through the last 18 months, I think, has been some of the most chaotic, but also most exposing of the kind of the rotten core of management at the heart of our universities, and students have been exposed to it brutally in a way that none of us would have wanted to have seen for the first time. And right now, even whilst our employers are putting out statements saying we can't go on like this, or we can't afford these things, these cuts are necessary, they are paying money for students to defer. Some of our institutions in the pre-92s are hoovering up students to the detriment of our colleagues that work at other universities. They are chartering planes yet again to bring students. They will squander money when it suits them. They will remain on hefty salaries all the while saying that their business model doesn't permit them to either pay us properly or fund our pensions properly. And I think this is why I just want to echo what John's saying, because this is as relevant for what we're going to say about four fights as it is this. We need to think really holistically about how we are going to create the leverage to make them have to change their mind in a way that we haven't done as meaningfully and as fundamentally as we need to, and who we need to reach out to for that as well.
Yeah, that is really helpful, and we've had lots of questions coming through as you've been talking, John and Joe, some of which are about different ways that members in different kinds of institutions, so for example members who are in USS but that's not the main scheme at their institution can get involved with that, and I think we'll be thinking really hard about how we can engage all different members in all different ways as we move forward. Very conscious of time, as I said. Unfortunately, we don't have time for many more questions on this. So I'm going to move us on to the four fights section of the today's session, and hope if we have time at the end we can maybe take a couple more that cover both. But as I said previously, we will be creating FAQs documents to pick up on anything we haven't had time to get to today. So thank you for putting forward all the questions, and keep them coming as we talk about forfights. Back to you, Jo.
Yeah, I just want to echo what John said before I say anything about forfights, is that this is not the last of these meetings we are going to do. We're holding this today because there's a lot to brief you on, and there's a special sector conference next week making lots of important decisions. But please do not feel my question wasn't answered today. I don't want to, I don't want to just see it in a Q&A. There will be more of these. Get used to our faces. So with forfights, the main difference, I think, between, or the way in which I see the difference between our USS dispute and our dispute over forfights, which, just to remind everybody, is pay, is workload, is casualisation, and then is quality pay gaps. My hope, maybe naively, my hope would be USS is not a perpetual fight, that it is a pension scheme, that we reform the governance of that scheme, that we have a valuation methodology that makes sense, and we don't have to go into dispute about it every time there is a valuation or every time our employers decide they're going to cut the value of the scheme. We have to accept as trade unionists, our employers will never give us enough on casualisation, on workload. They will always argue over pay. And, I haven't seen any employer really, or very few and far between, who demonstrate a commitment to better contracts for staff and to close a quality pay gap. So whilst USS might be a dispute that we move beyond, these are the central campaigning issues of this union, and they should be really of any union. So these issues are not going away. They are permanent issues for us. I was incredibly proud in 2019 that we managed to turn out a bigger mandate for action on these issues than ever before, because I feel like it completely vindicated what many of us have been saying for years, that these are our key issues and what we should be campaigning and fighting on. They're core, but as I say, even if we make progress on them in our next dispute, we will still be campaigning on them in 1 year, 5 year, 10 years time, and having more campaigns and disputes with employers. It may be every few years rather than every year. It might involve different tactics and approaches, but these issues will always be here. And a union that isn't campaigning for equality, that isn't campaigning for job security or workload, it isn't really worth its salt. It is different to USS as well in terms of its far broader issues and affects everybody in the HE sector, as opposed to just people who are in those USS institutions. Again, their special sector conference that's meeting next week, they will decide various issues surrounding these disputes and what we go about doing with them. Now, much like I did with USS, I just wanted to outline what I think winning looks like in the forfights dispute. It involves a pay rise. It involves an agreement that is meaningful on casualisation. It involves an agreement that is meaningful on our spiralling workloads. And it means a recognition and a strategy around reducing those gender and ethnicity pay gaps that we know exist, and in some cases actually are significantly worse than what we see in the private sector. The only way we will win is through a massive programme of sustained engagement with people across all of our HE branches, again, with industrial action across the whole sector. We need all VCs at all universities in the UK knocking on UCU's door saying, UCU is the employment representative body for this dispute, saying we need a settlement on this. If we want 100% of what we want, if we want all those 4 things, we need 100% of everybody involved and fighting this fight that is for the sector. And I think, just building on what John was saying, during this past 18 months, some of our branches that have done really well have grown massively. I just want to mention specifically the University of Chester, who have increased their density lots during this period, our Novus Prison branch, who doubled their union membership density during this period and have won big in their disputes. This is not something that we can't do. This is something that we can completely do and are doing. It does take work. but actually massively uplifting the conditions of our sector is going to take work. And the benefits for all of us, for our working lives, for our students will be well worth it. It will need the whole union working together. It will need strategic planning. A knee-jerk or quick ballot, I think, around this isn't going to deliver that. And I think, we need to remind ourselves of the huge amounts of work we've done in a small amount of time. I remember, and some of you might remember, how depressed you were when we only got 7 branches across the threshold. That went to 69, I think it was. This was phenomenal. As I say, it showed the union is not the union it used to be, and we will achieve that again. I don't think that's beyond doubt. The issue is we need to achieve much more than that again. And that is what this strategy that we're putting forward, or the campaign that we want to see, and the member level engagement that we want to see with it. So I'm going to hand over again to John to offer forward some sort of strategy around that.
Thanks. So just a couple of things I wanted to pick up on what Joe was saying. The first is, this is the core business of a union. Any union that isn't bargaining around pay and conditions isn't worth its salt. This is what we do. This is a fight of our own making. We want to improve the conditions of our members. Our members deserve better, and we are making the running on this dispute. This is our dispute. We're not being forced into this like in the USS dispute, where the employer is acting utterly unreasonably. They are acting unreasonably, but generically, and we will define the dispute, and we will shape and fight this dispute ourselves, because it's what we do. We will improve the pay and conditions of our members. But our members will need to be energised in that dispute. This is going to be a tough fight. It's going to be a long fight. There will be wins, there will be defeats all the way along the way. We'll win and we'll lose, and we'll keep going. And so we're going to need to have a long-term strategy that will involve industrial action to force the employer to positions around those 4 fights that we can begin to define as wins. We want to improve the pay of our members. We want agreements on workload. We want agreements on casualisation. We want agreements on equality, gender and race pay. Those are the things that we are fighting for, and they won't come easy. So how are we going to win it? It's going to be like what we were talking about with USS, only more so. We need, across the whole of higher education, a massive recruitment drive to bring in those people into our union who currently aren't members. And particularly when we're talking about postgraduate researchers, we're talking about casualised staff, we're talking about the whole range of our members. When we're talking about a casualisation campaign, we need to make sure we're recruiting those casualised workers, as many as we possibly can. So when we talked about an urgent recruitment campaign in the lead up to the USS dispute, we need to have that with knobs on to get thousands of more members to build a massive dispute. The second thing we need to have is a really strategic view to build industrial action. We need to have super majorities. We need to look at some of those basic tactics around organising. We need to have one-on-one conversations. We need to start testing our structures. We need to start mapping and charting where our victories are. We need to make sure that our members are being placed into battle on terrain of our choosing. And we will need to do that thinking. So again, branch meetings urgently to begin discussing what 4 fights looks like, defining what winning looks like within your workplace, thinking about areas where you are weak in terms of numbers and how you will recruit those people. Who is going to have those one-on-one conversations with members and with non-members? Start planning and charting and structuring how those conversations will take place, and start doing those things now. Start discussing the motions around 4 fights that are going to conference next week. Start to shape what the demands of you as members and what your members' demands and branch demands will be. And as we said earlier, talk to campus unions, talk to student unions, particularly if you're working in a university that isn't part of USS. Everything that we talked about with USS, you need to be doing. You need to be talking to your other campus unions, talking to the student unions, having branch meetings, preparing yourselves for a long fight. You're going to need to energize members. You're going to need to keep members involved. And that's what we said earlier. We're going to need to do more of these briefings to keep talking to people. We going to need to run a whole load of training programs for people in terms of organizing strategies so that when we are ready for the fight, we are as powerful as we possibly can be. So Jenny, I know we've got about 9 minutes left, so we've got questions and then some closing comments, I think.
Certainly do, yes. Thank you to John and to Joe for that really helpful information. Again, we've had lots of questions through, which is fantastic. We've got almost 1,000 people in this meeting, so you can imagine how many questions we're getting, and thank you for all of them. I'll try and sort of summarize again some of the themes that are coming through. I think lots of people asking around, I guess, coming back to sort of strategic and tactical questions, John, are we looking at combining these two disputes again, or are we looking at action separately? I don't know if you're able to say anything about that at this stage, or how we will get to the point where we will know. Lots of questions as well about how we can engage with our allies. So engaging with students, engaging with non-members, and the public as well. I think, some real concern coming through about the fact that many students have obviously been through a pretty tricky time with the pandemic already, and how we can counter that narrative that we're creating any further disruption. And then I think the other sort of slightly linked question to that's come through a few times is around how our approach to industrial action might need to change from the way it's looked in the past, now that more people are working from home, now that we've got a lot more lectures and teaching materials recorded, and therefore that might be used by employers to undermine us. So I don't know if either of you might want to touch on some of those issues. Joe?
I'll go first, and then I think John will probably want to pick a few things up. First thing to say is nothing has been decided in this meeting. This meeting is the best and most effective way at this moment for us to let as many people as possible understand, in particular, what's just happened with the USS, and I think correct some of the misinformation, update people on health and safety, and also outline what we think needs to happen regarding the campaign that we need to build around 4 fights in order that we win all of the things that we want. The decision-making mechanism and body of this union meets next week. If you are sat thinking, I want to be part of this conversation, I have things to say, great. What you need to do is pick up, or if you're in a WhatsApp group or your email, and get in touch with your branch and say, we need to have a conversation about this. I have strong feelings. I think this is the best strategy. I want to see the two disputes, run in parallel, or I think that this is the time frame. Those conversations, they're not happening here right now. They need to happen in your branch, with your colleagues, with your committee, because next week on Thursday, I think it is, there will be a meeting where every branch is sending delegates, and they will be voting on motions around some of those more strategic questions. So that's where you need to go if you're itching to have that conversation and have your say. I think in terms of students, we have been doing a lot nationally, working with the National Union of Students. I think it's worth pointing out, and I know I said this earlier, so I don't want to labour it too much, our students have been exposed to the most abhorrent treatment, many of them, in the last 18 months from universities. We have consistently, you will remember this time last year, UCU was one of the lone voices talking about just how dangerous what various UK governments did in terms of bringing students back, insisting that people, even those who didn't want to, who maybe had their own health concerns or disabilities, had to attend in-person activities. We have been there every step of the way. And I know that student groups really appreciate that we were there for them. I think that students understand actually the terrain very well, the political terrain. In my 2 years of being your General Secretary, of the many, many conversations I have had with students, it's minimal, the amount that have no sympathy. They might not always be happy about industrial action, but they tend to fundamentally understand why. I do think if we are looking for action that disrupts the entire sector, which I agree with John, we will have to engage in if we want to get all of our demands, we are going to have to work really hard with students, because I think they will bring a level of leverage to this dispute that we don't necessarily have. And I'm going to use the USS dispute as an example. Many of you who were there in 2018 know the power that those student occupations had. I think at one moment there was 17 to 20 occupations of various university buildings, students demonstrating that despite large-scale disruption of their education, they were standing with their staff. And the last 18 months, often it's been our lowest paid, precariously employed staff who do the bread and butter of teaching in universities that have been the ones who've been supporting them. So I am fairly confident, actually, that students will stand with us as they always have. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to work really hard in, as John said, speaking to those people, reaching out, starting those local networks or re-engaging with them. But, you know, maybe I'm going to come across a bit idealist here. The sort of education environment that I entered in 2009 when I first became a lecturer, and that I'd like to see again, is one where students and staff talk all the time anyway, is one where there is a really common shared agenda, because I think it is there. I just think obviously the nature of the relationship that management wants us to have with our students and colleagues distorts that.
I just wanted to say a couple of things. Firstly, one of the most inspirational disputes internationally in recent years was the Chicago Teachers Union strike back in about 2012, I think. And one of the things that they used to talk about when I met with Chicago teachers a few times, one of the phrases they used to use a lot: students' learning conditions are our working conditions. They are indivisible. And we have to use that language. The conditions that students are working in are the same conditions that our members are working in. We have to be unified about this. We have to make that link. The things that are damaging students' education are the things that are damaging our members' pay, terms and conditions. It's the same attack from the same people. That there's a degree of unity. And the second thing I just wanted to pick up on, Jenny, you asked a question about we need to have a more clever or more nuanced approach to industrial action. I think that's really important. Yes, we will be using strike action, but we will also have to be a lot cleverer, a lot smarter, a lot more nuanced over the next few months in terms of what that industrial action can look like as well. But the thing to remember is this is the best qualified trade union there is. You know, we will listen to our members. Our members will have the ideas and the tactics, and they will talk to us. So members talk in your branches. Branch officers listen to your members. Have those conversations. None of us are the repository of all wisdom. We listen to each other. We are a democratic union, and people should talk and listen to each other. And that's the way we'll come up with those winning tactics.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And as Joe said, you know, the big decisions are taking place next Thursday, so it's time to get back to your branches and have those conversations. We are almost at the end of this session. As we've said, this is not by any means the last time that we will be talking about this, or the last briefing session. We'll be putting together FAQ documents to answer questions that we haven't had time to get to after this session. And this session has been recorded, so you can you know, again, share it with colleagues who haven't been able to make it along today afterwards. But I'm going to hand over to Joe and John to make some final closing comments, and then we'll wrap up. So who's going to go first?
I'll just go very quickly. There are 3 things that we need you to do in the next week or so. 1, have a branch meeting. At that branch meeting, talk about health and safety demands, talk about USS, talk about full fight. So have a branch meeting. Second thing is get out and recruit members. This is the time of year to start recruiting, so get out and recruit members. And thirdly, begin those conversations with campus unions and student unions. Do those 3 things now.
And I will add, because I know this is in some ways, you know, the start of term that nobody wanted. You know, it would be lovely if for once the people who were earning vast amounts of money to lead our sector actually chose to lead it, and chose to lead it in a way that I think is compatible with the view that we all have of education. But they don't, and many of them simply won't. And we are all in UCU because we have a much better blueprint and idea of what education is, can and should be. Some of these disputes are us literally fighting for our income, our deferred wage, our future income, our take-home pay. the pay of lower paid members, the right for them to have an employment contract longer than 9 months and greater than 0.5, so they can live with some dignity. If our vice chancellors and our employers were the leaders that we wish they were, we wouldn't be trapped in these perpetual disputes with them, because they would manage the sectors properly, and they wouldn't be, dishing cash on private planes, hoovering up students from their competitors, and massive salaries for themselves. But this is the reality we're in. We have a hostile government who, especially in Westminster, does not care and is more interested in starting a culture war with higher education than actually ensuring that it remains, a world leader. So the conditions that we are facing are hostile. But, within 2 days, we have a meeting full of hundreds of people. We have a meeting next week that is going to be deciding some of the most important strategy regarding how we go forward with these disputes. So as I say, if you have been energized, if you have been inspired, do not just click leave meeting, open your inbox, get in touch with your branch, talk to people if you're back in work on your corridor or whatever networks you've got to be keeping in touch with people. Because just as we have saved our pension with USS from a DB to a DC in the past, just as at the Open University, we've shifted 4,000 people onto proper contracts rather than the casualised contracts they were on. Just as at Novus, we've kept people's health and safety during the pandemic, we can and will win on these issues. But much like our member said in June when we held our last meeting, it needs everybody. And it needs even more people than we've got now. So go forth, do the things that we've been asking you to. We will be holding more of these. Make sure you engage with your reps before they go to HESC next week, and take care, everybody.
Yes, thank you. It just remains for me to thank you to Joe and to John for all of that really helpful information. To thanks to Ed and Leon, who have been working hard behind the scenes to make this all happen. And to thank you to the almost 1,000 of you who have turned up today. I hope you are feeling as energized as we are and ready to go and take this on. So yeah, please keep tuned in to all the updates. There will be FAQs to follow. This session will be available afterwards. And yeah, I think go and have a lovely Friday afternoon. Cheers.